Thank you for coming, and I'm excited to be here, which sounds a little odd. Before I lost my husband, actually it was September of 2017, I said that I did specialize in grief. And now I'm not so sure I can say that I specialize in grief because I'm relearning what it means to walk through grief in the aftermath of this type of loss. So I have a lot of really good information to kind of share with you guys today. I know that in the audience there's primarily lay counselors and maybe some other people from the community, and I have some friends here. Thank you for coming to show support. I appreciate that. So there's a lot of, I think, good information. Just real quick, let me acquaint you with your packet. So the first part is the presentation, the PowerPoint that you see behind me on the screens. Immediately after that, this is a little write-up that I haven't included this extensively in my talk yet because I'm still kind of walking through this, but this is this idea of traumatic grief, and I think this is important. I will mention this as I talk today as we go through this presentation, but there's some good information in that little handout. And then after that, they very kindly included a couple of poems that I wrote from previous losses, which I hadn't read in a while, and when I read it getting ready for this talk, I was surprised at how relevant it still was, so that's good. So that's just for you. And then the very last two pages I intended to be kind of tear-out pages. So there's, as a therapist, I always like little quick handouts that you can give to your clients or your patients so that they can have something tangible to refer to. Now, actually, back in the day, it was paper. Now I'm emailing everybody so they have an electronic copy, but this is for you. You can feel free to recreate it. You know, there's some good information on here, and I will refer to some of them, especially towards the end. I'm going to talk about grief in children, so I think that's really important. Children have a very different expression of grief and a rhythm all their own, and so it's important to be aware. Now I know as lay counselors you guys don't deal with children directly, but you deal with parents, and so it's important to understand how to interpret the behaviors that children exhibit when they're grieving and help resource parents so that they understand what's going on and they don't respond in a way that's counterproductive and actually harmful. So that's what's in your packet. So without further ado, well, let me just say this real quick to kind of put this into context. So my husband had been, he had what's called AFib, and so there was a electrical issue in his heart. And so we had decided after a long, rigmarole with the insurance companies, we decided that he was going to have a cardiac ablation surgery. This was September 6th, I believe it was. And so it was supposed to be a routine operation, and he went through that. He came through it okay. He was not recovering well. And so we were a little scared about that, but death was definitely not on the radar. And then a week after the surgery, as he was starting to feel like he was turning a corner, he just suddenly died, and his heart stopped. What happened was he was, I believe now that he died in the shower, and I wasn't home. I was at my office, and our adult daughter, who had just started college, was at home. And I got the SOS text from her to let me know something had happened, and then she called me. We had previously talked about how to contact me if in case of an emergency. And she said, "Mom, Dad passed out in the shower. I called 911. The paramedics are here." And I was like, "Okay, do you need me to come home? What's going on? Are they working on him? Is Dad okay?" And she says, "Yeah, I need you to come home." Okay. So I shut the office down, leaving, fully expecting to come home to assess the situation. Something was going on, but it'll be okay and we'll figure it out from there. What I walked into was news that my husband had died. And not only did he die, because he died in the shower and my daughter hadn't discovered him for some time, he slumped down, blocked the drain, water overflowed, and so now I also have a flood in my home, which I'm still recovering from. I just recently remodeled the bathroom, and then I've got flooring to replace. So this was my triple whammy. I was sick with a bad cold, as was my daughter, which is why she was home from school that day. My husband died suddenly, unexpectedly, and I have a flood in my home. So I tell you this to put this in context, because later when I talk about a little bit about traumatic grief, so that you understand that there's multiple layers that go on. Just the fact that he died suddenly would have been enough to deal with. But now we also had to deal with, there's water in the house, we need to call insurance, water abatement guy, this, that, the other thing. So that was challenging. So when you're talking to people about their story, their loss story, it's important to understand what all the factors are that come into play, because they matter. And sometimes some of the details that you don't think would matter, they do matter. So, and we'll talk more about that as we go forward. So that's kind of a synopsis of my story, and I will talk more about it as we go through. So I wanted to start with some grief misconceptions. This idea of the goal of grief is to get over it. And any of you that have been around in grief circles, you'll understand that this is a misnomer. It's really more about getting through, getting through sometimes moment by moment, and finding the resources that you need to get through those moments. Someone who commits suicide doesn't deserve my grieving. This is an interesting one. We actually had my husband's best friend in 2008 committed suicide. She was struggling with a mental disorder, and it was a shocking thing. He actually found her. And so we walked through that loss, and that was quite a traumatic loss as well. And so we walked through so many different things related to that, as far as how do we handle the memorial service, how do we discuss this, do we disclose it, all that kind of stuff. And everybody has a different way that they want to package their narrative around this. So one of the things I would say is, we're curious people, and when we hear that somebody died, we want to know how, and we want to know what happened, and why, the why question, right? And so sensitivity dictates to pause and not ask quite so many questions, because it can be overwhelming to the grieving person. But the whole thing about suicide, the grief rituals that we do, the mourning rituals and the grief that we experience is for us, the survivors. And so it's important to understand that, things like, grieving somebody who seemed to be selfish, or, say they died of an overdose even, accidental or otherwise. Sometimes it feels like, well, I don't want to cry over that person or whatever. But again, that's a misnomer, because we grieve because we hurt over the loss. Another misconception, I can't ever laugh again. My daughter and I, we actually laughed the next day. Not at death, but it was crazy. We get home, and there's all these emergency personnel in our home, and the police officers, ma'am, I got to ask you some questions, and they're asking us the same questions over and over again. I guess they have a protocol to follow, to make sure there's no foul play or whatever. But they're asking the same questions. Like, the one that really irritated me the most was, what's the name of his doctor? I told him the name. What's his phone number? I don't know. He asked me that 3 times. And I said, can you get Google out and look it up? Because, I don't know. I can't think straight. And so when my daughter and I were processing the day after my husband's sudden death, the ridiculousness of what we experienced, it was just like out of a movie, and so there was kind of this release of tension through humor. Grief process doesn't look the same for everyone. This is something that I have been learning firsthand, obviously, as I walk through. One person, which is John Lister, my husband, was my husband. He was my daughter's father, and he was somebody's friend, and his parents have since passed away, like they passed away before him. But there's different relationships, and so the relationship will dictate how different it is, as well as how regular that person is in that person's life, the survivor, and personality type. I'm an extrovert. I can't stop talking sometimes, but I will finish by 12:30 today. And my daughter's an introvert. She's social, she's not a recluse, but I had to respect how she expressed her grieving very differently than how I did, and vice versa, because the things that she found helpful were not helpful to me. And then I had to be aware of what was going on with her. Now, I will say, obviously, because of my education experience and my profession, there was a lot of knowledgeable things that I knew. I understood, walking through the days, weeks, and months after the loss of what to look for and what to notice. But it didn't diminish the pain, so darn it. I don't think anything diminishes the pain. The next one is grief has a time limit. This is hard for the grieving person. Right after I lost my husband, I did connect up with some other widows, and in fact, I think it was about a week and a half after, I remember one friend of mine came over and she said, oh, this is just the beginning. And I thought, good God, I've already felt like an intense amount of pain, and like this is the beginning of a long journey of pain. Like, don't tell me that. But it doesn't have a time limit, and it's more like rhythms. I like the word rhythm because rhythms have an up and a down. It has an out and an in. It has sometimes winding around. So think in terms of grief rhythms, and it's not linear. And then also grief and mourning are not necessarily synonymous. Sometimes we use those terms synonymously. The way I'd like to identify it, grief is more of an emotion. It's the feelings. And I found this really interesting definition where it says it's the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So it's the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. That's one of the definitions of grief. That's a more internal experience versus mourning is an external experience. It's an expression of deep sorrow, and it typically associates with actions. So we have a lot of mourning rituals that we do, and it varies from culture to culture. In this culture, we might have a viewing, we might have a graveside service, we might have a memorial service or a celebration of life service. Those are all mourning rituals. We might have receptions afterwards, where we get together and that kind of thing. And that's a way that we can kind of grieve together. So here's some more definitions. So loss, I know this might seem a little, rudimentary. It's a profound sense of disconnection from something or someone that previously held a significant place in our lives. Now, when I'm talking about grief, it's not just about a physical death. It's the death of anything. It could be the death of a dream. It could be the death of a marriage through divorce. It could be the death of an opportunity, a job loss, something that you have come to expect that has been a regular part of your life experience, and now it's no longer there. And so, of course, the most dramatic is a physical death, especially if it's somebody that you're close to. But this definitely applies to other things as well. Grief is the navigating what it means to live with the reality of the loss of that someone or something. Now here's an interesting one, unresolved grief. So I started going to a grief group, and by the way, EV Free here has a fantastic grief group. They meet on Tuesday nights. I've referred people here. I did come, but because of some specific things that I experienced, not at anybody else's fault, but because I'm in the community as a therapist and I need a safe place to go, I actually ran into somebody that recognized me for my professional channels, so that didn't work for me. But that's okay. I ended up going to another grief group elsewhere. But this grief group here is really good, and I would highly still recommend it. The thing I like that they do that's different than the group that I currently attend, they break it up by loss. And so they have a first part of it is the lecture part, and then the second part is where you have a small group based on the type of loss. As you might imagine, the loss of a spouse is very different than the loss of a parent, which is very different than the loss of a child, or the loss of a younger child versus an adult child, or the loss of a close friend. All these different losses, they bring up different things. So unresolved grief is that delaying the emotional processing that needs to happen. There are no shortcuts. There just isn't. If somebody finds one, could you let me know? Because I'd like to sign up for that. But to my experience, and again, even though this is the most significant, most recent loss that I've had, this is not the only loss that I've had. So when you delay grief, you're not willing to acknowledge this new sense of reality that doesn't include the thing that was lost or the person that was lost. Now, this is one of those pay me now, pay me later type of things. Years ago, I was, actually, I met my husband in an auto mechanics class, which people always find really funny. Anyway, my auto mechanics teacher, the wise man that he was, he would say, if you don't maintain your car, you're gonna either pay me now for the maintenance or you're gonna pay me for the repairs and the big stuff later. So grief is that. It's a pay me now, pay me later. You're either gonna pay now in the emotional processing that you need to do, or you do have a choice. You can push it aside, but it's gonna leak out in areas that are like very uncomfortable and not helpful at all. So the more you can encourage people to confront their grief, the better it will be, the prognosis for them. Now, one thing I do want to talk about, this new normal. I do not like that term, and I had to ask myself, why don't I like that term? I don't have a full answer for that yet, but here's what I'd like to propose. Rather than talking about a new normal, how about let's discover a new rhythm? Once again, I think rhythms of life is more accurate. We have a natural evolution that occurs within our lives based on the people and the factors that are included, at any given moment. And so it's important to understand that we have changing factors. There's life events, right? When you're younger and you graduate high school, that's a life event. You maybe go to college or start your first job, that's kind of a life event. You move out for the first time, life event. Get married, life event. Have children, life event. Death of a spouse, life event. So it is a life event. It's a major life event. And whenever you come across a major life event, you have adjustments. And so that's part of what we're talking about. I don't want to diminish the pain that this particular life event has when you have a major loss, but nevertheless, it is a life event. And so if you can try to encourage people to put it into a category of this is part of the rhythm of life, that might be helpful. So here are some factors affecting the grief process of a person. So of course, type of death. Is it sudden versus a prolonged illness? I talked to other widows that their husbands had died after, like a prolonged illness, and there was a different rhythm. I think I'm going to use that as my term here. There was a different rhythm to losing that person than if you lose them suddenly. So the type of death does matter. The relationship to the deceased. Were they a person that was in your regular life? Now, interesting little side note on this. They don't have to be. They don't have to be to have a major impact. I had a cousin who died quite suddenly in Boston. That's my city of my birth, is back in Boston. He died suddenly from a brain aneurysm. And my grief over losing that cousin, I hadn't seen him in years, but he was part of my childhood. And I realized, oh my gosh, I lost a connection to my history. I lost a connection to somebody that would have had memories and would have had input into my personal history. So even though, and this might even sound stranger, if somebody that's well known, like suddenly dies, and then a person seems to have a reaction, a grief reaction, you want to explore representationally who was that person to your grieving person, because it's about what they perceive that person was to them. And they may not necessarily have been a part of their personal everyday life, but something significant emotionally, psychologically, even spiritually was going on for your person that you're counseling or whatever. So you can explore that. Experience or history of losses. How resolved or settled are the previous losses that the person that you're counseling has been through, or you for that matter. When we don't resolve things, life has a funny way of bringing them back around until we get to resolve them the next time. Somebody once put this way: God doesn't he doesn't care if you so-called fail your tests. He'll just give it to you again and again and again and again until you pass. And so sometimes I wish we could just, okay, I got a D on that one. Could we just put that aside and move on to the next thing? And God's like, no, but I want you to get this. Developmental stage. You can't grieve what you don't realize what was lost. My daughter, who is she's going to be 20 this year, she's grieving the loss of her dad in this stage of life. Those of us that are older, we can anticipate what losses she's going to confront as she moves through the lifespan. And so those kinds of experiences, they won't be on her radar, they won't be on a young person's radar until they get to that part. They won't be on my radar. I'm thinking ahead, right? Because thankfully my husband was alive at her high school graduation, but we have college graduation to get through, and I know we're gonna feel that. So there's a number of developmental things that are coming up for any of us, that experience a loss that you can't anticipate them all, but there are some kind of bigger ones that you need to be aware of. And no matter how committed you are to your grief process in a given time, when you feel the pop on your radar later, it doesn't mean that you didn't do it right. It just means that something else just came up and you need to be aware of what you need to express or explore around that new thing. Spiritual or religious beliefs, things like the meaning making that we have, beliefs about the afterlife. I gotta tell you, I'm not sad for my husband. He's in glory. I believe that he's with Jesus. He's in the throne room of the Most High God. Hello. That's where I'd like to be. And I believe I will be someday. And think about this too. In a moment, in the blink of an eye, he was delivered from all of his unhealed, broken woundedness that he lived with, in this life. And so I'm so happy for him. I'm so sad for me because now I have to figure this thing called life. I told my friend the other day, I'm an individual living two persons' life because I've got a house to manage. He was my gardener. He was my cook. I'm like, darn it. I have to do all these things now that I used to have a partner to do. And so I'm kind of navigating that. So your spiritual and religious beliefs can bring about a source of comfort. Now, on the flip side of that, it can bring a source of distress. If if you're working with somebody who doesn't know what they believe or they're confused, in some traditions, they might teach that, if you commit suicide, you go to hell type of thing. And so you want to be able to gently and carefully explore, what a person believes about the afterlife and give them an opportunity and a space to find their narrative around that. Other stressors, life responsibilities, they don't go on hold. Don't you wish that you could just freeze everything and do this thing for a while and then come back to life and filter it in? It doesn't work that way. You have to just kind of, once again, the rhythm. You have to kind of go swimming in those waters, go surfing in those waves, and just do the best you can. But you do have to scale back your expectations. I had to ask myself, can I still do marriage and family therapy in the aftermath of losing my spouse? Can I sit with other people's pain? Can I empathize? Can I even function mentally, because I'm so preoccupied. I did take a little bit of a period of time away from work, and I literally just had to kind of come back and try it. See how I feel, try it. And I did disclose to all my clients when I came back. I got rid of about a third of my practice at the time. And then I disclosed to every single person, this is what happened, and I may not be firing on all cylinders, so I need you as an informed consumer. If you don't feel like you're getting the care that you need from me, we need to talk about that. I know you've been with me, you like me, that's great, but you need the care that you need, to receive. So being aware of how stressors affect you is so important, so you can kind of work with people to ask them. And sometimes this comes up in really weird ways. If somebody is reporting to you that they feel more irritable or they're annoyed or impatient, All those things are clues, or, typical stuff like, say they drive the 91 freeway, which that alone in itself would be enough to drive anybody to the brink. But they drive it and they're regular, and then all of a sudden they say, oh, you know what, I just got so angry and this and that. Pay attention to those kinds of things, because that might be an indication that there's some processing that they need to do. Because really, what is it? What's really bothering you? I bumped up against this a lot, both, me and my daughter. We would have little bickering moments. And the surface thing, as you know, those of you that have been doing any sort of counseling, the issue is not the issue. The issue is just the surface thing, and then you have to dig underneath to see what's going on. So those are clues to kind of go further. So life stressors, cultural expectations. There's a pressure to be okay by others who may not be comfortable with expressions of grief. So sometimes a therapy room is the only safest place just to let it all out. And I'm not embarrassed to say I am in therapy. I'm going to my therapist, and there's times when I'm in there and I'm just bawling, and I need to. Crying is a very cathartic, appropriate, therapeutic, relieving exercise. And so if the person that you're seeing this is the only safe place for them, then that's great. Then you're offering them a containment for that. Social support is really important. I feel like I'm the poster child in trying to get people to really kind of like make relationships. I have people coming into my office that, they don't identify any friends. And so we start talking about how they can, get themselves out there and to find social support, social interaction, and this and that. Because people to listen and other practical help is going to be part of what helps a person move through their grieving. Because there is a lot of additional pressure that happens in the wake of a loss. And then resiliency. How does a person typically face adversity? So if you're working with somebody who, you can ask them, like, what other difficulties in life have you overcome? And, what did you do to help yourself through this, that, or the other thing? And so it gives them an opportunity to reflect back upon the fact that they do have resources within themselves. They do have inner strength that they can tap into, and they can get through this one. This is another, time where they can move through adversity and get to the other side. So, I wanted to talk about metaphors. Metaphors are really good because a lot of these concepts we talk about, they're really intangible. They're kind of ethereal, right? So one of them was this idea of a new road unexpectedly, and so we tend to try to find our way back to that old road. So people talk very nostalgically, or like I just wish ... X, Y, and Z. Another one is a house that lost its cornerstone. It's still standing, but it's off balance. The prolonged illness, I came up with a new one. I actually like the idea of recovering from an injury or even an amputation. Because really, when you lose somebody that's close to you, it's an amputation. And think about it this way. If somebody lost a limb, they're still living, they're still functioning, but they have to adjust, they have to adapt to life without that limb. Any of you see that movie? What was that movie that the girl lost her arm in the shark attack and it bit her arm off? Soul Surfer, yeah. Any of you guys see Soul Surfer? It was a really neat movie on so many levels. There's a lot of really good spiritual encouragement. But the gal, she found a way, her and her dad, on her to continue surfing, and they made accommodations to her surfboard so that she could, paddle and still get out there and duck dive, under the waves and stuff like that. So one of the things that we need to be aware of, on the outside, you look normal. The people look like, okay, well, they're functioning. I look pretty put together, right? You don't see me in my moments, which is not appropriate anyway. So it's a matter of learning how to adapt without this additional person or this thing that was significant in your life. And so there's adjustments, and you have to be patient. I like this one, squeezing a tube of toothpaste with the lid on. It will come out somewhere. So once again, pay me now, pay me later. You're either gonna feel this and grieve it and move through it, or you're gonna avoid it and it's gonna come upon you at the most inopportune times. A couple of my own metaphors that came to me when in the immediate aftermath of my husband's death. I had to move out of the house, by the way. So the flood, happened, and we called the insurance guy to get the water out and this and that. And I don't know if any of you have ever had a flood in your home, but they bring these like gigantic dryers or like, this sound. And I thought, good God, if I'm in this house when these things are going off, I can't be responsible for what I do. So my best friend down the street in Brea, she let me land there for about a week and a half, which was actually a great respite. But I'm a go-getter. Like I said, I'm an extrovert. I'm a go-getter. I just the Energizer Bunny. And all of a sudden, I was coming up against this like drag on my energy. And so one of the metaphors that I got was I was driving in second gear. Those of you who ever driven a manual transmission, you're still going forward in second gear, but you can't go very fast. And so you have to kind of adjust. You'll still get there wherever you're going. Another one was because of the circumstances of my loss, I felt like somebody had come into my house and dumped 8 to 10,000 piece puzzles all over my floor. And now I had to sort through them all and kind of figure out where they go. And I was like, oh my gosh, how is this? Like, that old adage, how do you eat an elephant? Like one bite at a time. That's gross, sorry. But anyway, so it was very challenging, and I had to really, be patient. A really sweet metaphor that God gave me was, I had a picture of myself as a little girl, and I was holding on to my papa's hand, and I was wandering around in a room, and I would stumble across something, and I'd pick it up, and I'd say, Papa, what do I do with this? And he'd say, here, let me take that for you. Okay, here you go. And we're wandering. Papa, what do I do with this? Here, let me put that away over there, and we'll do it later together. And I'm like, Papa, what do I do with this? And it was that simple, and it was that specific, because I literally didn't know what to do. And so I came to know God as my Papa in that season, and I still feel that He is, and He's yours too. So anyway. So whatever metaphor makes sense to you, and you can also ask your clients or your patients to, think about metaphors that make sense to them as well. And when we do that, it somehow helps us to wrap our arms around what we're experiencing. So here's some grief concepts. Phyllis Silverman, she was an author and researcher on grief, and she talks about these different things that we lose. We lose the person with all their uniqueness. So the memories, the recollection of our shared history, their ideas for the future. Now they do live in our heart, right? Because if we have a relationship with a close person, they have informed who we are, so that's something you can explore. I did a really interesting thing with one of my clients one time. She lost her mom, and we were talking about, she had very complicated feelings about her mom. There was parts of her mom that she really loved, and there was parts that she was just really like her mom was negative and critical and this and that. So we started to explore, okay, what do you think affected your mom's ability to be the supportive, loving mom that you wanted or needed her to be? And so we talked about mom's history, and she was able to identify things and she could understand. And I said, oh, okay. I go, what if you could have a conversation with mom? I'm not saying like raise the dead or whatever, do mediums or whatever, but just have a conversation in your imagination with mom, the parts of mom that were healthy, the parts of mom that would have been free of these other hindrances to give you input. And she found that to be a really productive exercise. And she was able to kind of allow herself to tap into these parts of her mom that were true. We didn't make this up. But oftentimes that part of her mom got overshadowed by, the other, the distortions that her mom was living with at the time that she was alive. So this is after her mom died. So this person was able to have a period of interaction, if you will, through her imagination with her mom that was meaningful and productive. We also lose their input into decisions and their wisdom. Our relationship with this person is lost in all of its places of support and or unfinished business. Unfinished business is difficult when someone dies. I'm very thankful. When my husband died, we were in a really good place. But I'll admit the last year of our marriage was really challenging. We had a lot of flare-ups. We'd been married 24 years, and anybody who's been married any length of time knows that you have, again, the rhythms up and down and all around. We were very committed to one another, and he was a good man, but he had his, brokenness, and I have mine, and those oftentimes bump up against each other. But at the time that he died, right away, I was like, wow, we were in a good place, and I'm so thankful. I have no regrets. I had 24 years with this man, and he was a gift to me. And I will forever be thankful for that. I wish I had more, of course. I always wish I would have had more. But I did have what I had, and for that I can be thankful. So depending on if the relationship was not in a good place, I had a friend who lost her husband that there was immediate regrets. That's another journey that you're going on with that person to explore. And there are ways to satisfy unfinished business with someone who has died. But it's kind of an incremental process, and it has a pace all its own. And I won't get into that too much right now, but if you have anybody like that and you want to talk to me afterwards, I would be happy to talk more about that. And then the other thing we lose is our sense of ourselves that we experienced within the relationship, including all the ways we discovered ourselves. We are relational beings. God designed for us to be in relationship with one another. And so what an amazing, wonderful thing, right? Because it's like we're not islands, we're communal. And frustratingly so sometimes, right? Because sometimes it'd be easier if I didn't have to consult with another person, or take into consideration their preferences, their likes, dislikes, whatever. So, but we do lose that. Excuse me. So that can be very impactful. Probably the most famous kind of ideas around grief is these, the phases of grief by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was a pioneer researcher in the terminally ill. Now, I include these not because they're my favorite, but because they are still very pervasive. And I want to highlight these because they are absolutely not linear. And they are valid because we do experience these, and people do experience these. But the problem is whenever you talk about in psychological circles, we try to categorize things, and we try to make little boxes and neat categories, and it doesn't work that way because there's so many factors affecting what we think and how we feel in any given moment, and we surprise ourselves. We think we're going to do this, and then we go there, and so it doesn't always fit in neat linear structures. But denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, they are present. But I saw a graphic, I should have included it, but the crashing waves is actually quite, I think, really good on this, because sometimes these different feelings converge. Whoops, sorry. They converge, and so what happens is you might feel like in a millisecond you might feel denial, and then anger, and then denial again, and then depression, and then acceptance, and you're like, whoa, what the heck's going on? It's like you get this emotional whiplash inside of your head. But that's part of the organization inside of your head. Your mind is trying to make sense of this. As a grieving person, they're trying to make sense of this. And really, this is the frustrating part. You cannot make sense out of nonsense. Death was never in the original design. That's why I think it's so chaotic for us. God never intended for us to die and to experience separation. How devastating. So yeah, it's chaotic because it is. So be aware of how these different things, these elements come. And by the way, acceptance, one of the things that I've noticed even as I'm walking through my journey, there's different pieces of acceptance that come along the way. So a person might come to a conclusion or feel an acceptance about one thing, but then something else pops up on their radar, and all of a sudden they're going through different emotions and experiences through this all over again. Or there might be another element to what they thought they had settled and accepted, but they turn and look at it a different angle, and now they're like, oh gosh, I didn't think about that. And so they're going through that whole rigmarole all over again. I'm a part of some online grief groups, and one of the graphics that I saw that I thought was hilarious was it was a graphic of like this line that was a squiggly line that was like all over the place, and it said, "This is your grief journey." So just be aware of that. One that I particularly like is by John Bowlby. He was an attachment theorist. He pioneered that work, and he wasn't necessarily grief wasn't his his focus, but it comes up in his work, and I liked the terms that are used here because they're very descriptive. The first one is numbness and shock. So it's this kind of like what just happened? Like whoa. Like this disorientation. The second one is yearning. If any of you have ever felt yearning, unfulfilled longings, just this pull inside of you, this like almost like a voracious appetite that cannot be quenched, that's what we're talking about. Because you cannot get back what's not there anymore. It's impossible. It is literally gone. And so that yearning produces a bunch of different emotions: anxiety, anger, despair, confusion, sorrow, all those different things. So be aware of how people are presenting, and when they share their loss narrative with you, pay attention to what emotions they seem to be in touch with. Parts of their loss narrative might sound like they're very numb and neutral and almost like detached, and others may sound like they're really very close to it. So all of those are wonderful clues for us as clinicians to kind of help navigate that with them. Disorganization. When you lose something of significance, it's disorganized because that thing or person that was previously there as a resource and something that you can utilize is no longer there. So you have to figure out what you can do in place of it. This goes back to this idea of adapting. And then finally, reorganization and recovery. So moving into this idea of making peace with the current reality. You may never like that reality, and I don't think that's a goal. We're not going to tell people, okay, your goal is to accept and like this reality without this person in your life. That's just not realistic, because you like the reality that included that person. That's why you had them in your life in the first place. But now they're gone, and so you have to come to peace with this reality that doesn't include them. But here's something else to think about that you can share. Once again, I'm really big on imaginative work. I think God gave us such an amazing outlet in our creativity and our imagination, and we can tap into that so that we can provide hope and just a way to connect with our loved one in a way that is biblical and also helpful and comforting. So when you are talking about making peace with the current reality, you can talk about how that person can still include memories of their loved ones and even creative what's the word I'm looking for? Creative ways to include them in the present. And here's an example. My husband's my father-in-law passed away. And so this was in 2006, and we were on a trip. And so as we were going away, looking at different shops and everything, we ran across things that reminded us of his dad. And so John and I would look at each other and go, oh, Jack would have liked that. And then we would make up oh, what do you think Jack would say about that? Because we knew his rambunctious personality, we'd start kind of making something up. So in a way, that was our way of continuing Jack's presence in our current reality, even though Jack wasn't physically there anymore. So now Evie and I are in the process of doing that, right? Because her dad is forever in our hearts and part of our personhood, really. So as we are acquainting ourselves with this reality that doesn't include John's physical presence, his spirit is with us. And so I think that can bring a tremendous amount of comfort. Oops. So some common feelings and reactions, this idea of being torn between the past and the future, things like feeling isolated or lonely, of course, sorrow, depression, anger, impatience, indecisiveness, guilt, relief. I added a couple others that aren't here. One of them is uncertainty. I think uncertainty is definitely an important thing to acknowledge and confront, with people that have a loss, because there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of unanswered questions. And like I said earlier, when I said, Papa, what do I do with this? There was a number of those things that God told me, just, hey, let me hold on to that for you right now, because that's too far in the future. You don't need to worry about that. I'm like, okay, here you go. Just like a little girl, right? When, those of you that have kids, it's like we're happy to take those burdens off of them, because as adults we can handle it. In the same way, that's what God was doing for me in the early days, and even now. I have a lot of unanswered questions. I don't have it all figured out. People ask me some questions and I'm like, whoa, I don't know. I don't have a 5-year plan right now. I'm just trying to get through the next couple years, and I'm doing okay with that. And then at some point we can talk about my 5-10-year plan, and that's okay. Another thing is fear or panic. In one of my grief groups, they were talking about this idea that grief has elements of fear attached to it, and along with that, anxiety or even panic. So be aware of that role and listen for language from people that you're working with that sound like fear or panic. A lot of times I work with people that have like anxiety disorders and stuff, and so I try to bring them back into the present. What's the most important thing right in front of you? And by the way, this is definitely important, like good information for me to remember too, as I'm kind of moving through this, because you can't tackle too many things at once. It's too overwhelming, so you have to break it down. Okay, let's talk about resiliency real quick. There's a lot of stuff on, if you Google resiliency, you'll get some really good stuff. So it's basically the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, and there's these different factors. So you want to assess for these too. So see what kind of, once again, poster child, what kind of caring, supportive relationship. So that's a red flag, right? So you want to encourage them to develop those. And I got to tell you, I cannot tell you the number of times I've had people say, I don't have anybody I can talk to. Okay, well, you're talking to me, so you know how to talk, and you know how to interact. So let's talk about what areas of community exist for you. Work is one. I will admit that people that are not in church communities, it is much more difficult to get them plugged into community, because church does have that element of community. It's kind of here. Now, it's not always, your favorite community. There's a lot of personalities. The bigger the church, the more personalities. Then again, I go to small church, so we have our own sets of personalities. And I love my church, by the way. So, but get them get them thinking outside the box. There is no shortage of meetup groups, meetup.com. You can point them to. There are libraries that have book clubs. Even if you don't like the book, just go and interact. There's community classes and stuff that are free. I forgot what they changed the name to, but it used to be called the North Orange County Community College District, which is in this area, and I think they just call it North Orange something now. Anyway, they have classes. They're free, for crying out loud. It just takes time. And so if, there are outlets to kind of point people to if they are struggling to have that sense of community. This next one's really important, the capacity to make realistic plans and carry through. This is very, very important. I consistently, as I've talked to my therapist walking through this, I've had to readjust my expectations of what I can produce. Remember, I'm the Energizer Bunny. I just like to go, and be productive, and I'm very active. And in this season of my life, God has slowed me down. And that's not been a pace that I really like. But I'm learning to value it. So you have to be able to talk through what is realistic with the current circumstances that you find yourself in. Is this a good idea? There's a book called Your Best Yes. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but it's another take on boundaries. And being able to walk through a process on how to say yes. There's different factors. It's not just, is it a good idea? Well, what does this mean spiritually? What does this mean practically? What does this mean emotionally? What does this mean logistically? And is this a good time? So helping them to make realistic plans and consider what's hindering them. Now this is the thing, the push-pull of grief. Nobody really likes grief. Grief has an energy. Like any emotion, all emotions have energy. Some are up energies, some are down energies. Grief is a down energy. Nobody likes to be down. Some people, do. They're melancholy and they like that. But, having them understand, once again, the rhythm of grief. You don't always have to stay down. There is a balance. Positive self-view. Listen for their self-talk. They might have a victim mentality or a woe is me or a learned helplessness is one of the terms in my field that we talk about. Their communication skills. How well are they able to not just communicate with other people, but within themselves? How well are they able to identify their own limits and their own challenges and their own emotional state in a given moment? They need to be able to identify that and then communicate that to others, what they need. The last one, ability to manage strong emotions and impulses. This is really important. In the face of a major loss, like what I've experienced with the loss of my husband, I've had more surprises than I could count. And I've surprised myself. I think I'm a pretty solid person. Otherwise, I wouldn't be up here talking to you. So anyway, I've surprised myself by the things that have kind of knocked me off my feet and the things that I thought were almost no-brainers that wouldn't register on my emotional radar, and then things that I thought wouldn't register on my emotional radar, and that hasn't been according to expectation. So, but through all that, being able to, once again, weather those ups and downs and being able to contain. Containment is a big thing. Let's talk about containment for a minute because I think that's important. So life has a lot of triggers. And when you're grieving, triggers are everywhere. One of the first kind of phrases that came out of my mouth after I lost my husband was, everything, everything. Everything reminds me of my husband. Everything. This is going to sound so ridiculous, but the day after he died, I was at my girlfriend's house, and they were asking, what do you want on your pizza? Well, of course, what comes to my mind? Oh, we used to eat pepperoni pizza together. And I mean, it was that pervasive, Or the question, what do you want? Well, what do I want? I want a husband. I want my husband back. oh, you mean what do I want on my pizza? Okay. So being able to manage and contain those strong emotions, you can only do that successfully if you make a pact with yourself, and this is what you can talk to your people about, make a pact with yourself to revisit it. Otherwise, it's avoidance. Because it's funny, I'll talk to people, are you good at putting things away? Oh yeah, okay, so when do you go back to them? I don't. Okay, that's not containment, that's avoiding. So you want to encourage them to make a pact with themselves to go back, make an appointment even, to go back and revisit what their strong emotions are trying to tell them. It isn't an internal communication system. When something bothers us, if we're angry or if we're irritated, that's our body's way of trying to get our attention and say, excuse me, I need some help here. And so if you just go away, ignore it, then it just ends up coming back like that tube of toothpaste, like I mentioned earlier. Okay, practical tips in grief. Here's some things that you can kind of talk to them about. I mentioned already, understand triggers, things like songs and movies. This isn't on here, but you can add it. Understanding the role of triggers is super important, and that they're pervasive everywhere, especially if any significant loss is going to come with it, triggers everywhere. Like I said, songs, movies, pop culture, conversations in a group setting. Before my husband died, we had a couples group that we were, there's us and 2 other couples that would get together. In fact, today after I'm hanging out with them, they very graciously still want me to be a part of the couples group, even though I'm not a couple anymore, and that's okay. So being aware of how the dynamics work. In the beginning, I was asking myself, how do I feel when I'm around a group of couples? I'm missing my partner. I'm missing my best friend, my lover. He was my dude. He was my backup. I backed him up. He was a lot of things to me. And so there's triggers everywhere. Another practical thing is cry. People don't like that one. because some people are okay with it, that's great. But other people I've had to talk to them about, crying does not mean you're weak. Crying does not mean that you're pathetic. Crying does not mean that it doesn't equal self-pity. It doesn't mean that you are broken, devastated, or unfixable. You know, there's nothing to fix. Crying is simply an expression of grief. And the desire or the impulse to cry is evidence of the depth of relationship that you had with this person or this thing. Again, it could be a perceived connection in the case of, say, somebody that you didn't think that the person might be very close to, but it's how they represent, that connection in that person's mind. Other things: pray, meditate, journal, exercise patience and more patience. Use expressive art. Down here, I have a number of little pieces. My daughter is an art major, and we, as a family, we really dove into artistic expression. We did that before my husband died as a family, and we definitely dove into it even more so after he died. And some of these pieces up here, you can come up and look at them later. You can interpret them however you want. It was just me having fun with paint on paper, as well as my daughter. And just being able to just have an artistic, expressive outlet that does not use words. I understand, like within session, it may not be as practical to use paints, but you can use crayons. I've used crayons with people, markers. I like crayons better because crayons have more blendability, and so there's a more fluidity to what that looks like versus markers. Of course, there's some blending markers out there, but crayons are less messy. And adults actually do like to do stuff that would normally be thought of as play therapy that you do with kids. I have a sand tray in my office, and I have definitely had adults use the little figurines and put the figurines in the sand tray and do some expressive kind of things with that too. So think outside the box sometimes and see what you can come up with. Again, adjust expectations. Participate in mourning rituals. Things like memorials or releasing exercises. So I mentioned that we just redid my bathroom, and the floors were down to the concrete. And I got inspired to do a little mural on the floor in the bathroom. That's where my husband died. And I did a tree, and I put a verse from Thessalonians, the one that says that we don't grieve as those who have no hope. And that, and I knew it was going to get covered up with flooring, and it is. Now it's covered up, but that's okay. And then my daughter did another one, off to the side. And I found it to be very therapeutic and comforting. And we left a mark there. Someday that won't be our house, and people won't know it's there, but I do. and it felt very honoring, like that was like another form of expression. Choose process partners wisely. Not everybody's going to be able to listen, to process. So when you work with people, talk to them about who's a good person and how to assess who's a good person. And I try really hard not to take things personally, because you know what? This is my journey. This is my story. This is my process. It's not somebody else's. And they have their own lives. So I'm very careful to not overburden my friends with too much of my stuff, because it's not fair. I am a little bit more needy in this phase of my life. And a lot of my friends have been very gracious to be patient with me. But you want to make sure that you help guide your people to identify, okay, if you have, say you have a conversation with somebody and it doesn't go the way that you want, all right, let's talk about how did that make you feel? What happened? What were you expecting? Let's talk about your disappointments. Can you find someone else? Or what about a conversation with somebody that did go well? What was it about that conversation and that exchange that was, helpful to you and meaningful, so that you can help them to assess the differences, because everybody's got their own stuff, and it's okay. Other people's lives do go on, and that's hard for the grieving person. And they know it up here. But it's like they're so hurting. It's like, God, why is the world still going? Don't you know what just happened to me? Well, yeah. But that's what happens. It still keeps going. Take care of yourself. So talk about self-care, learning how to say no more. and having downtime. A spiritual practice that I've been doing now for 6 years that I've just recently adjusted. I was going down to Corona del Mar has a beautiful beach, and there's if those of you are familiar, there's Pirates Cove. Back in the day, there's a lot of baptisms. Actually, when I was in youth ministry here, Eric Hurd, who is the youth pastor, he baptized me down at Pirates Cove, which was pretty awesome. And so I go down there. I was going every other Friday. Now I've stuck it on my calendar for every Friday. So I go down there for 3 hours. You know what, you guys, we live in paradise. People come here to vacation. I'm like, are you kidding me? That Pacific Ocean is not gonna like enjoy itself. I need to go down there and enjoy it. So I've been doing that, and this is something that God said, come away with me. Come and spend time with me. So encourage people to do stuff like that, you know, like whenever possible. My schedule affords me that I can kind of do that, so I enjoy doing that. Delegate, ask for help is important. Don't try to do everything on your own. This is a little bit of a challenging one though, so be aware, like even as, like I've got so many projects at home, sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna be asking for help. It's a good thing I know people like in like different churches, so that I'm like, okay, let me talk to this group of people. This is what I need help with, and then so I don't overburden you. And then I'm going to go to this group of people, and this is what I need help with. So it's kind of hard sometimes for the grieving person to get organized. So sometimes within therapy or the counseling session, that's a great time to spend that time to help them get organized. I did that one of the times in one of my sessions with my therapist. And that gave me a little bit of a roadmap. It helped me kind of get my arms around stuff to go, okay, from a practical standpoint, this is what needs to happen. And then expect more grief work at various life stages. Let me talk real quickly about, because this is important, when a client's grief triggers yours, make sure that you are aware. Practice self-awareness, those of you that are counselors. Be mindful of what causes you distress. I had a situation, or you know, this just happens anyway, but even more so, there's certain areas that I'm much more sensitive to right now. And as a therapist, you know, there's this idea of being vicariously traumatized, which is when you hear somebody else's difficult story, you tend to kind of absorb those emotions and feelings, and they stick to you. You have to kind of, you know, wipe them off type of thing. And so be aware of what triggers you. You know, take breaks and that kind of thing. Containment again. Breathe through the swell. You know, you can do appropriate self-disclosure, you know, within sessions. You know, what you just shared with me is pretty heavy. And, you know, I'm actually wondering how to respond to that. You know, it's something that we can discuss and work through together. And let's do this process of discovery, you know, jointly. And then allowing yourself to explore and express your own thoughts and feelings in your own therapy. I think having a supervision group is fantastic. I'm in private practice, and I do have colleagues that we share office space together, so there's a lot of good times of where we can interact with one another and consult with one another, and even at times pray with one another, which is great because some of my colleagues are Christians, so we can kind of, you know, be there for each other that way. In the books, in the resources, I wanted to add a book that just kind of came to me through a friend of mine, a fellow widow. This book is called Part of Me Died Too. Part of Me Died Too, T-O-O also. And it's by Virginia Lynn Fry, F-R-Y. That's a book that kind of deals with children. And so I want to segue into, in your handout, the one handout that says Grief Handout, Terms, Tips, and Treatment. I want to drop down to grief in children. I want to draw your attention to that in the last few minutes that we have. I want to cover this and then traumatic grief, and then we'll be done for now. So grief in children. Although I know you may not be dealing directly with kids, you'll be dealing with other family members that have children, and kids can be kids or teens or, you know, young adults. So obviously, most of the time, kids have a less problem expressing their emotions, depending on if it's safe. Now, their emotions come off typically very intensely and very strong, and depending on what messages they got leading up to the loss about acceptable emotions will determine what emotions come out. So if it's not safe for them to express sadness or sorrow, it will more likely come out in either like withdrawing, like depression, or it'll come out in anger or some other acting out behaviors. So this is where it's important to help identify what's going on, especially if you have, like my daughter, for example, you know, there was a couple of times initially, or even like now as we've moved through, you know, the time, where like she's pretty mild-mannered. We get along really well. I'm very thankful for that. We have a strong relationship, but we sometimes snap at each other, and then we have to stop and go, okay, what was that about? What's going on here? And so that's, it's a clue. So when you talk to parents, especially if their kids are kind of acting out, or especially if they're doing something that's really not characteristic of what they normally do, don't think like, oh gosh, what happened? My wonderful child just turned into this, like, you know, awful demon kid or whatever. No, something's registered on their emotional radar and they just don't know what to do with it. And so you breathe, don't take it personal. Okay, sweetheart, what's going on? You know, you seem like you're upset. I'm not upset. Okay, well, you know, let's just take a breath. I don't want to take a breath. All right, well, let's take a break, you know, and if you don't want to take a break, mommy needs a timeout right now, and I'll be right back. One of the funny things I used to say to my daughter when she was younger is, go to your room and get a better attitude. And when you find a better attitude, you can come out of your room and we'll talk. Play. It is normal for kids to forget. You know, as adults, we might be falling apart, but the kids are like off doing their thing, and it's like, you know, like, what? You know, the world is falling apart and they're playing. Well, that's okay. That is the balance of life, because in grief, again, rhythm. There needs to be a rhythm. There's going to be peaks and valleys, and that's all part of the normal part of grieving. And then, of course, acting out. And they might be impatient with themselves or others. They might be excessively sensitive. And so you want to, you know, be mindful of that. And the last thing I wanted to cover is grief trauma. On the back side of that handout, there is grief trauma. So I just want you to be aware. Signs of trauma that I identified, things like foggy brain, irritability, impatience, all these different things that are listed there. Some of you may be familiar with the post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's symptoms that would, you know, meet criteria for that. You don't have to meet criteria for PTSD in order to have unprocessed trauma. That's really important to understand, because otherwise you're going to be looking for more symptoms than what really is necessary. You know, there's treatment protocols, and if you're interested in that, we can talk more about it at the end. And let me see if there's one more thing I wanted to mention. I really do like this little handout about this traumatic grief. So take a moment to read over that and see if there's anything there that you might have questions on. I'm going to end our time now because I wanted to honor our time. And I think Dave's going to come back up and close us out. So thank you. Oh, thank you. You're so sweet.